Welcome, fellow servants of the Dark Gods, to Oldhammer Reviews, where today we'll be taking a look at the 1994 Chaos Space Marines Plastic Squad. Let's get into it. These Chaos Space Marines were the first plastic season. That is, if we don't count the 1990 Space Crusade plastics, which we don't for this series, because we only talk about mainline GW stuff. Now on the back of the box we have a little bit of flavor text in various languages.
Warped and twisted by the corrupting touch of chaos, the brutal Chaos Space Marines ravage the universe, destroying all who would dare stand against them.
And of course there's a little bit of fine print. Now let's open up this little treasure, shall we? Inside the box you find 5 sheets of decal for the Night Lords, the Alpha Legion, the Black Legion, the Word Bearers, and the Iron Warriors. Sadly, my box is incomplete, as you can see. On the decal sheets you can just see how the legions used to look back then, with the Night Lords having a bit of a more funky skull. The Black Legion had a bit of a less comic-y style of logo, and was mainly just a yellow star with a little hard to see eye actually on the inside. Meanwhile, the Alpha Legion remained virtually unchanged, only sporting a 2-headed variant in the early decals, but their 3-headed variant still seems to be the same as today. Moving on to the sprues, you will have 3 body sprues, only 2 displayed due to 1 missing, which include the upper body and the legs. In regards to the details, you will see they look very familiar with the kit that came after, the one we've been used to up to 2019, and they are just looking a little more flat. Sadly, they do not have any head articulation, so they will always look forward, and it does look a little odd. Next we have a piece that should be very familiar to everyone, an arm and weapon sprue. Something I doubt anyone who was around back at the time has missed, because it was there in almost every Marine set, not only in the infantry boxes but also in many of the character boxes if they came with only 1 arm. So you had a captain or a sorcerer or librarian, which came with 1 arm sculpted on, so for example a force sword, and the other was left, so you could add one of these plastic arms. This one here being a small variant of the sprue, meant for chaos. And lastly we have just a standard backpack sprue, the chaos backpack in this case being a bit thinner than the version that came after, but still having the look that we have nowadays actually. Though to be fair, I do not recall them having any sort of banner variant, unlike their loyalist brethren. Now, as you can see on the sprues, it says 1996, which would indicate the sprues have at least been made back then, but I don't think they've been released. At least I could not see it in any of the catalogs from that time that I searched up on Story Legends. They only appear 1 or 2 years later. Though then again, they do not make mention of plastic Chaos Space Marines anyways, and the range wasn't all that big in these catalogs, so maybe an oversight? Either way, and now we come to an entirely new part of these kind of videos, build and paint, because I figured you might want to see how the miniatures look if they're painted. Though be warned, it won't be to a high standard, it will just be a quick paint job that will look okay, but I won't win any prizes with it. Now, what I can tell you after assembling these Chaos Space Marines is that they are really easy, and you will feel right at home if you have built any of the previous generation of Marines, be it Firstborn or Chaos. What I would like to point out is the fact that they have a flat joint between the legs and the torso, unlike the round one in the 2nd generation, which means they can just be left after being glued. do not have to maybe be held up because they would tilt over or just fall off the socket again. So it could be considered a plus, but then again it is also a bit of a con because you cannot let them look up with their body sort of, or have them hunched over a bit. So yeah, I guess it's up to you. If you want to build them in batch, it's much easier. But if you really want to go for unique miniatures, then the kit might not be so good for that. Which brings me to a point which I'm not certain is fact, but is a suspicion of mine, that the plastic kit, which was just 5 man, was to be considered a booster to the metal 10-man squad box you could find, because, as I said, there is a bit of a lack of detail with the flat hats, so maybe that's just due to the fact that they are not meant to represent a whole unit, but instead just serve as unit fillers, which would make very much sense, considering the Metal Marines would be a bit pricey, and buying a unit every time you need an additional Marine, or 5, is a bit annoying, so they introduced a plastic 5-man squad, which would also be the transition into mainline plastic kits instead of metal. After my little rant and assembling the Chaos Marine, I've decided to actually compare him in size to the other 2 generations following him. So here you can see the Marine on the right, next to, in the middle, the 2nd generation, which has been in service for the most time, and then the newest one, which is one from Blackstone Fortress. I apologize, I did not have an unpainted one, but yeah, you can see the size difference between the 2nd generation and the 1st is actually pretty okay, but there has been a steep size increase with the 3rd generation, which I guess is something we all welcomed a lot, since the old ones still were considered the mini-marines. But getting back to the building and painting, as for the color scheme, I actually decided to pull a easy starter tutorial how to paint Iron Warriors from the 1st edition of the 3rd edition Chaos Space Marine Codex. People who dig a lot in Oldhammer will understand the confusion. Kill! Kill! But it's the one with the grinning Chaos Space Marine on the cover. So after a quick undercoat of Chaos Black, we are ready to paint. Since the previous part about the Codex was a gag that I added in post-production, I still refer to the Chaos Codex in the recordings. So yeah, there is that bit. To start off, we give the miniature a prime with black, making sure it's all nicely covered. You also want to make sure everything's ready, so get your tissues out and get some clean water. And let's begin. We are starting off with Iron Warrior, and we're just gonna dry brush it all over the miniature to get a nice metal effect. As this is the very first coat, we can be very rough with it. Just make sure it covers nicely. Once you're done, we want to move on to Iron Hand Steel to give a little lighter of a dry brush to accentuate the metal a little and make it shine more. This can be achieved by simply using less paint on your brush and also doing lighter movements over the miniature. That's 2 steps down and we already have a beautiful looking metal effect. Now we can move on to painting in the details. For the next step, we do what we all love, picking out the rims with a little Retributor armor. At this step, you want to make sure you thin your paint a little and get a nice sharp tip on your brush. And don't forget to pick out the Chaos Star in the backpack, otherwise you'll have some bad luck. After that's done, we're going to move on to Black Templar, with which we're going to paint all the black non-metallic parts. So for example, the tubing on the helmet or the bodysuit, which can be seen through the gaps of the armor, as well as dabbling just a little on the ammunition strap coming out of the bolter. On occasions like these where we have just few little spots of color. I'm very thankful for a contrast because it makes it so much easier to quickly paint and cover up. Now, one detail that's black that we cannot just contrast is the casing of the boulder. So for that we're just gonna take some old Abaddon black and slap it on. As an optional extra step, you could also then apply a thin highlight of Dark Reaper or Ashen Grey to pick out the boulder casing a little, but since I'm just doing an easy paint up, I will not do that. Next up are the horns with Carrick Stone, but here is where I'm deviating from the given color scheme because I just did not like the red horns, so I went for a classical bone colored horn scheme. After we've applied the base color, we're then gonna tint the lower parts of the horns with some snakebite leather diluted with some contrast medium. While the technique is quite simple, you want to make sure that the most of the color pigments are on the lower end, and up top you will have less and less, so there is just a slight hint of a transition, which we're then going to reinforce in the next step. This technique is to imitate the natural look of horns, which are always a bit darker from where they grow, and lighter towards the end of it, where just a normal shade would simply tint all of the horn. But this technique will ensure that there is a slight color transition. After everything's dried, we then want to dry brush some Carrick Stone back on the middle and top of the horns to reinforce the color transition we have made earlier with the contrast. To ensure we don't ruin what we have made earlier, we will make some slow stroking motions upwards, so away from the contrast and up to the top of the horns. Once you're happy with the results, you can then move on to add a final highlight, which will also be dry brushed and is Screaming Skull to give very light tips to the horns. We simply repeat what we did before, but the stroking motion this time should only be focused around the tips of the horns. With the horns done, we move on to Evil Sun Scarlet to paint the eyes, and trust me, it sounds scary, but it's not that hard actually. To prove it's not that hard, I actually didn't use the best brush I had, so the tip is a bit shitty on this one actually. And you just want to make sure you have a good tip, then you put your mini sideways and begin putting paint on the inner side of the eye, slowly pulling out towards the outer side. Repeat until satisfaction. And while this already looks mighty fine, you could call it done at this point, we still want to add just a little bit of highlight to the eyes, which we are going to do with some Fire Dragon Bright. Now we're going to repeat what I told you before, but this time we do only one stroke to ensure it's a nice and bright highlight. And with the eyes finished, the whole marine is finished. Of course, it does require some basing, but I'm not going to show you that here. You can base however you want. But here we go. That's a really easy to do Iron Warrior Chaos Space Marine. Now, what are my final thoughts on this kit? I would say it is interesting. You are clearly reminded of the generation that came after, but in my opinion, they really do not hold a candle to the metal versions. I mean, from the limited number you get in the box, it is clearly stated that you're not supposed to build whole units out of them. But still, for being the probably first plastic marines, here, Space Crusade not included, they seem to do a meh job. I mean, don't get me wrong, they do have their merit in some regards. I mean, they make nice unit fillers, and I'm sure it's fun kit bashing a little with different Legion shoulder pads. But if you ever had to choose between getting a box of the metal Chaos Marines from the first generation or getting a box of the plastic ones, I think everyone would choose the metal ones. Hey, you made it through another video of mine. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it when you watch through all of it, because I know my videos are not to the best of qualities. I'm still working on it, and I did try again to reinvent this format sort of with this video. So instead of doing a numbered rating at the end, I just gave a little thought on it, and I also tried to paint one of the miniatures to not the best standard, but a decent one, I'd say, tabletop standard. So thank you very much for watching, and if you liked it, you can like, you can subscribe. You can check out my social medias where I post a lot of my painted stuff. Where also, like a month ago, posted this marine, which I painted because I had this video going for a few months and I just could not get my ass up to edit it. So I'm very sorry for that. But let's hope I can crank out the Halloween video this week and in time. Otherwise, I'm gonna be very mad at myself for that. Also, if you have a friend who likes Oldhammer and maybe has had these miniatures back in the day or is just generally interested, you could show them that video. Spread the Oldhammer love, because as big as the community is, it can always get bigger. With that said, hobby on, have a nice evening, have a nice morning, have a nice noon, I don't fucking know where you are, at what time you are. So, enjoy. Bye!